I always thought telling him would be one of those perfect moments. You know, the kind you replay in your head for years, candlelight maybe, or laughter echoing off the walls. But when I looked him in the eye and whispered, "I'm pregnant," the air shifted. He froze. His eyes didn't soften, they narrowed. And in that instant, everything warm between us drained like water down a cracked sink. He didn't reach for me, didn't smile. Instead, he just stared like I'd said something disgusting. Then, with this quiet venom, he asked, "Whose is it?" At first, I laughed, because how could that possibly be real? But he wasn't joking. His jaw was clenched, his voice flat. I waited for it to be some sick joke. It wasn't. He walked out of the room without waiting for my answer. After that day, something in him shut off completely. He stopped coming home on time. When he did, he barely looked at me. I tried to talk, to make him see reason, but he kept turning it into an interrogation. "Where were you on that Thursday? Who were you texting back in March?" It was like I was on trial in my own home, and the verdict was already decided. Worse still, he didn't keep it between us. Suddenly, his mother wouldn't return my calls. Our friends stopped inviting me out. At a barbecue, someone joked about mystery babies, and I knew where it came from. Daniel was poisoning the well. I begged him to stop, to trust me, to talk to me. His response? "Get a paternity test. Then we'll talk." He planted a seed of doubt and watered it with cruelty. I stopped recognizing the man I'd married. Daniel used to bring me coffee in bed, used to run his fingers through my hair and tell me he was lucky. Now he barely acknowledged me, unless it was to glare or toss some sideways comment that stung harder than a slap. I felt like I was haunting my own house, drifting through rooms where love had once lived. And every time I looked in the mirror, I asked myself the same question. What did I do to deserve this? Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head, looking for the crack, the exact second when everything fell apart. My mind became a prison, trapping me with thoughts like, maybe I wasn't affectionate enough, maybe I forgot something important. But deep down, I knew the truth. His accusation had nothing to do with me and everything to do with something broken in him. Still, I tried to keep the peace, for the baby. I tiptoed around his moods, smiled when I wanted to scream, shrank myself just to keep him from detonating. But no matter how small I made myself, he always found a new way to chip at me. He started missing doctor's appointments, ignored the ultrasound photos I left on the fridge. Once he even laughed when I said I'd felt a kick. "Are you sure it's not gas?" He smirked. That one stayed with me. And as his cruelty grew louder, so did my silence. Because somewhere, buried beneath the ache, was still a part of me that believed maybe, just maybe, this was fixable. That if I could just prove my love, he'd come back. But what I didn't realize then was that I wasn't fighting for our marriage. I was fighting for someone who had already decided to watch me drown and call it self-inflicted. The thing is, betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It shows up in the way someone avoids your eyes, or how their voice sharpens just enough to sting, but not enough to leave a bruise. That's how Daniel moved now, like a man who'd rewritten history and cast himself as the victim. And I was just the villain in his story, sentenced without a defense. Every day it chipped away at my sense of reality. Every day I questioned myself a little more. He started coming home later and later, said he was swamped with work, but wouldn't show me his calendar, wouldn't tell me where he was. And every time I asked, he acted like I was the crazy one. "You're getting paranoid," he said. But the irony wasn't lost on me. He accused me of infidelity while disappearing for hours, days, without explanation. And yet, somehow, I was the liar. I was the problem. Friends I once considered family stopped reaching out. A few even sent me cryptic messages, hinting that I should just be honest with Daniel. I realized then he hadn't just doubted me. He'd broadcasted that doubt to the world, planting seeds wherever he could, watching them grow into a forest I couldn't find my way out of. I was being judged by a jury I never got to face, in a trial I never agreed to. And the cruelest part? I still loved him. Not the man he was now, but the version I remembered, the one who held me when I cried after losing my dad, the one who called me his home. That version was long gone, and I knew it. But letting go of that memory felt like losing something sacred. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. Not while the life growing inside me deserved every ounce of fight I had left. Because if Daniel could plant a seed of doubt, I was about to grow something stronger. Stress doesn't always look like panic attacks or screaming fits. Sometimes it's just silence, a heavy, crushing silence that clings to you the second you wake up. That's what those days felt like for me. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my hand instinctively cradling my belly, whispering, "You're safe, you're safe, you're safe." But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. My body was tired, my soul even more. It started small: dizziness in the kitchen, a fainting spell in the shower, a pressure in my chest I couldn't quite name. My doctor's tone changed after the third visit. Warm concern gave way to clinical caution. "We're entering high-risk territory," she said, her eyes scanning the monitor. "You need rest. You need peace." I almost laughed. Peace? There was none left in my life. Not at home. Not in my heart. Daniel's response to all this? Distance. He wasn't angry anymore. Not in the loud, slamming doors way. No, now it was worse. He became indifferent. Barely spoke. Barely looked up from his phone. He had business trips suddenly. Lots of them. Always urgent. Always important. I stopped asking questions. I already knew the answers. Or worse, I knew the emptiness that came when none were given. So, I did the only thing I could to stay sane. I started writing everything down. I opened a journal and began documenting it all. Dates, absences, comments that cut like blades. Not for revenge. Not yet. But to remind myself that it was real. That I wasn't imagining it. That this wasn't just hormones or paranoia. This was pain, raw and real, and it had a timeline. There was one night I'll never forget. I was in the kitchen trying to eat something, dry toast maybe, when everything started spinning. My knees buckled before I could call out, and I hit the floor hard. When I opened my eyes, Daniel wasn't there. Just the cold tile against my skin, and the echo of a silence that felt like abandonment. I crawled to my phone, hands trembling, and called a cab to the hospital by myself. The nurse kept asking me if I had someone she could call. I gave her my sister's number. Not Daniel's. Not anymore. That choice felt like betrayal, but also like relief. My body was fighting to protect this tiny life, and I couldn't keep waiting for someone who had already left in every way that mattered. The monitors beeped steadily. The doctor adjusted the IV and said, "You need calm, or this baby might come too early." And I remember thinking, what calm? When Daniel finally showed up, he smelled like cologne that wasn't his. His excuse? The flight landed late. He kissed my forehead without emotion and spent the next hour scrolling through emails beside my bed. I watched him from the corner of my eye, wondering how we got here, how love had drained from his touch, how indifference had replaced devotion. I didn't cry. Not in front of him. I saved my tears for later, when the lights were out and no one was watching. I kept journaling, not just what he did, but how I felt. The fear, the loneliness, the quiet strength I was trying to stitch back together. I even started writing letters to my unborn child, not to be read now, but someday, so they'd know I fought for them, even when no one fought for me, so they'd know that love wasn't supposed to look like this. And that sometimes protecting someone means learning how to survive the storm, alone. The hospital became familiar, too familiar. The scent of antiseptic, the soft rustle of nurses' shoes on the linoleum, the dim light that never really let you rest. It all blended into a kind of numb routine. I'd spend hours lying there, hooked up to machines, trying to keep still, trying not to panic. Every movement, every cramp felt like a warning sign. And yet somehow, Daniel's absence hurt more than the needles. One afternoon, a doctor asked if I was under emotional stress. I almost laughed, but instead I nodded. He gave me a look that was equal parts professional and human. "It's not just about your body," he said. "What's in your mind, in your heart, that matters too." That hit me harder than I expected, because by then I'd stopped thinking my feelings mattered. I was so focused on surviving, I'd forgotten I deserved more than survival. I remember staring out the hospital window, watching rain streak down the glass, and in that moment, I whispered something to the baby. Not a promise, a prayer. "Hold on, little one. We're not done yet." I felt my hand press gently to my belly, as if shielding us both from the world beyond that glass. There was something unspoken between us, a thread connecting my heartbeat to theirs. And I knew I had to protect it at all costs. Daniel didn't come that night, or the next, but I didn't feel empty anymore. I felt something different, something new. Maybe it was resolve. Maybe it was the slow, quiet beginning of a shift. Because I realized then, I wasn't waiting to be saved. I was gathering the strength to change everything. And the truth? The truth was waiting too, and it wasn't going to stay buried for much longer. When she finally held her baby for the first time stood still. The sterile chill of the delivery room faded, and all Sarah could feel was warmth, the weight of a tiny life against her chest, the softness of new skin, the rhythm of a heart that had fought to keep beating. They were here, safe, whole. And for the first time in months, her tears weren't from pain. They were from something almost forgotten, joy. She named her daughter after her mother, the woman who used to whisper, "Truth needs no defense," during the worst storms of Sarah's childhood. It felt right, like passing down a shield made of wisdom and quiet defiance. As she traced her baby's fingers with her own, Sarah made a silent vow. This child would never feel unwanted. She would never grow up wondering if she was enough. She was already everything. While nurses bustled around her, Sarah reached into her hospital bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside was the DNA test kit she'd ordered weeks ago, tucked between prenatal vitamins and lotion she barely used. Not because she needed it, but because he demanded it. Because somewhere along the line, proving her integrity had become another survival tactic. But this time, it wasn't about him. It was about reclaiming the narrative. She swabbed her daughter's cheek gently, as if touching a miracle, then her own, sealed the test, labeled it, and felt the weight lift, not entirely, not yet, but enough to breathe again. There was no fear, no dread, just certainty. Whatever the results said, she already knew the truth, and so did he. That was the part that burned, not the accusation, but the fact that he always knew and still chose to destroy her anyway. When the envelope arrived a week later, Sarah didn't hesitate. She opened it at the kitchen table, the same one where Daniel once accused her with that cold stare, where so many nights ended in silence and suspicion. The paper was simple, no frills, just a number, 99.99%. Daniel was the father. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She just sat there, holding the truth in her hands like a quiet victory. She could have called him, could have screamed, "See, I told you." But that felt too small, too reactive. Instead, she waited. waited until he showed up, all smug and casual, like the last few months hadn't happened. He made some comment about the baby's nose, said it didn't look like his. Sarah didn't even blink. She handed him the envelope without a word and watched his expression shift as he read. There was no shock in his face, no gasp. Just a flicker, something uncomfortable, something he tried to mask with a forced shrug. "Well, guess I was wrong," he muttered, setting the paper down like it meant nothing. But Sarah saw it, that tiny fracture in his composure, because deep down he had always known. He hadn't needed proof. He needed power. And when she refused to break, that power began to slip. In that moment, Sarah realized something else. This wasn't about DNA. It never had been. This was about control. About dismantling her from the inside out until she no longer trusted her own reality. But now, the tide was shifting. She was no longer begging to be believed. She had the truth. And more importantly, she had herself back. And that was more dangerous to him than any piece of paper. Later that night, Sarah sat by the crib, watching her daughter sleep. The soft rise and fall of that tiny chest, the curled fists, the peacefulness, it gave her clarity. For months, she had let herself be dimmed by someone else's insecurities. She had tried to negotiate with cruelty, tried to make space for a man who only ever carved emptiness. But now, with truth printed in black and white, she felt a quiet kind of fire starting to grow. She began printing copies, one for her lawyer, one for herself, and one, just one, for the moment she'd been waiting for. Not to argue, not to beg, but to dismantle the foundation of lies he'd built around them both. Daniel hadn't gambled on her breaking. He gambled on her staying silent, on her becoming small, pliable, afraid. But Sarah was none of those things anymore. The next time he tried to twist the narrative, tried to play the victim or toss another smirking insult, she was ready. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply handed him the facts and watched his face fall under the weight of what he already knew. Because you can't outrun the truth when it's handed to you, sealed and verified. And watching him squirm? That wasn't revenge. That was liberation. He tried to laugh it off, of course, said something about moving forward. But Sarah didn't respond. She was already thinking ahead, further ahead than he could imagine. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And the loudest part of it would be the silence she left in her wake, because now she didn't need to prove anything. He gambled on her silence. She was about to become louder than ever. She didn't rush it. That's the thing about real revenge. It doesn't come screaming through the door. It arrives quiet, calculated, dressed in preparation. Sarah knew she had to be smart. This wasn't about making a scene. It was about reclaiming her life, inch by inch, with receipts. So she hired a private investigator, not because she had doubts, but because she wanted evidence solid enough to crush every lie he ever spread. The results came in quicker than she expected. Photos, hotel records, messages. Faces she recognized, one of them belonging to a woman who'd once sat at her dinner table, calling herself a friend. Sarah felt her stomach turn, not with heartbreak, but with clarity. While she was curled up in a hospital bed, fighting to keep her baby alive, Daniel was out playing house with someone else. No apologies, no shame, just pure, practiced betrayal. That same night, she emailed her lawyer. There was no dramatic music, no tears. Just a subject line, filing for divorce, effective immediately. Then she opened a folder on her laptop titled Proof. Inside were screenshots, voice notes, timestamps. The DNA test was in there too. She wasn't just ending a marriage, she was preparing a case, one that wouldn't just set her free, but make sure everyone who doubted her would finally see what she'd endured. And then she did something Daniel never saw coming. She went public. No gossip. No screaming into the void. Just facts, delivered with surgical precision. She sent the folder to his family, their mutual friends, his colleagues. No commentary, no vengeance. Just truth, dressed in silence, with his name stamped across every betrayal. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about revelation. And she wasn't done yet. The responses started rolling in almost instantly. Some called. Some wrote emails that read like half apologies, trying to walk back the things they'd said, the silence they'd kept. Sarah read them all, quietly. She didn't reply. Not yet, because she wasn't looking for redemption from people who had abandoned her at the first whisper of scandal. No, what she wanted was acknowledgement, and now, finally, they were listening. Daniel, on the other hand, unraveled quickly. The image he'd built, the charming husband, the loyal provider, cracked in front of everyone. He tried to spin it, of course, blamed miscommunication, stress, even hinted she'd manipulated things. But the evidence didn't lie. He hadn't just lost the benefit of the doubt. He'd lost the very illusion he used to control everyone around him, and it was glorious to watch. At work, things got tense. A whisper here, a look there. And then, one morning, Daniel walked into his office to find a manila envelope on his desk. No note, no signature. Just everything Sarah wanted him to see, laid out cleanly and unmistakably. The paternity results, screenshots, affair timelines, all of it. She wanted him to feel the weight of it in his hands, to hold the proof, to feel the consequences settle into his bones. She didn't have to witness the moment. She'd already imagined it enough times. The panic behind his eyes, the realization that every lie he told had finally come home. He tried to call her later, 3 times. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because for once, Daniel was sitting in the ruins of a story he couldn't control, a story written entirely by his own hand. And she was already rewriting hers. In the days that followed, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. Not the quiet that comes from isolation, but the kind that follows a storm, when the wind finally dies and you can breathe again. She could walk into her own kitchen without bracing for a comment. She could hold her daughter without fear of being called a liar. The house, once filled with tension, now belonged to her, truly, fully, finally. She began moving forward, not in a dramatic, tearful montage sort of way, but in the quiet rituals that rebuild a life. Morning walks with the stroller, coffee sipped without a knot in her stomach, small things that felt like victories. She wasn't angry anymore. That emotion had burned through and left something sharper in its place, clarity. And with clarity came purpose. She wasn't hiding anymore. Not from the shame he tried to dump on her, not from the people who looked the other way. She'd faced it all, humiliation, heartbreak, near collapse, and she was still standing, stronger, sharper, unshakable. And Daniel? He was unraveling in plain sight. The truth had a way of doing that, stripping down facades until all that's left is the person beneath. And he didn't like what he saw. But Sarah didn't look back. She had no reason to. The child he once doubted now smiled in her arms. The life he tried to break was blooming in spite of him. And while he sifted through the ruins of his carefully crafted image, Sarah was busy building something real. Because he tried to deny a child. And in doing so, she denied him everything else. Courtrooms are strange places. Cold, quiet, but charged, like a storm just waiting to break. Sarah sat there, not with fear, but with calm. Her lawyer at her side, documents neatly stacked, truth wrapped in folders and witness statements. Daniel was across the room, less put together than usual. No crisp tie, no arrogant smirk, just the look of a man who finally realized he wasn't untouchable. The tables hadn't turned, they'd flipped entirely. The case wasn't difficult to build. Emotional abuse, abandonment, infidelity, all documented, all undeniable. Sarah didn't have to exaggerate anything. The truth was enough. And as her lawyer laid it out with precision, Daniel fidgeted, shifted in his seat, glanced at the gallery where his reputation once mattered. No one was on his side this time. Not even the judge seemed moved by his last-minute pleas for understanding. When the verdict came, it was like exhaling after holding her breath for a year. Full custody, the house, monthly alimony, a legal acknowledgement of the damage done. But it wasn't about winning. It was about protection. For herself, for her daughter, for every woman who's ever been asked to prove what should have been trusted from the beginning. And as the gavel hit wood, Sarah didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes and let the moment settle into her bones. Daniel, meanwhile, was left in a pile of consequences he'd never prepared for. The shallow affairs, the money funneled into hotel rooms and lies, the whispers behind his back, the job on shaky ground. Everything he built to look like success was now crumbling under the weight of his own choices. And Sarah? She was just getting started. Freedom didn't come with fireworks. It came with paperwork, long days and quiet nights filled with a different kind of silence, one that no longer felt like punishment. Sarah settled into her new life like slipping into something familiar and warm. She painted the nursery the color she'd always wanted. She started sleeping again. Real sleep. The kind where your heart isn't clenched the whole night, waiting for the next blow. But she didn't stop there. There was something growing inside her. Not bitterness, not revenge, but purpose. She began volunteering with a local group that supported women going through high-risk pregnancies. Eventually, she started a foundation of her own. Not with fanfare or press releases, but with deep conversations, one-on-one support, and resources for women who felt abandoned in their most vulnerable moments. She became a quiet force, the kind you feel before you ever hear. And while Sarah moved forward with intention, Daniel tried to maintain whatever scraps of image he had left. But without control, without someone to manipulate, he floundered. Every social event became a minefield. Every sideways glance a reminder. He learned quickly that reputation is fragile, especially when built on someone else's suffering. And unlike Sarah, he had no anchor, just regret disguised as bravado. One afternoon, a journalist reached out. They were covering her foundation, wanted to interview the woman who turned betrayal into something beautiful. Sarah hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she understood the weight of words now. She agreed, but only under one condition. This wouldn't be a sob story. It would be a story about survival and what happens when a woman refuses to stay broken. The day of the interview, Sarah wore a simple dress. No designer label, no statement pieces, just calm. The kind of calm that's earned. The journalist was kind, curious, asked about the foundation, about the journey. Sarah answered with honesty, but without dramatics. Her power wasn't in raising her voice. It was in the steady way she carried her truth. And then came the final question, the one she knew would come. "What would you say," the reporter asked gently, "to the man who once called your child a lie?" There was a pause, not for effect, but to feel the weight of that moment. Sarah looked down, then back up, eyes steady. Her voice didn't waver. "I'd say," she began, "that sometimes the blood doesn't just prove paternity. It reveals who was human and who was never a man at all." The room went quiet, not out of shock, but out of reverence. Because the truth, when spoken like that, doesn't need volume. It echoes all on its own. That quote would later headline the article, shared thousands of times. But for Sarah, it wasn't about attention. It was about closure. Not the kind you wait for, the kind you create, the kind that comes when you choose yourself every single day. That evening, she rocked her daughter to sleep, humming softly as the sun dipped below the horizon. She kissed her forehead and whispered a promise. Not of perfection, but of presence, of showing up, of never letting anyone make her feel small again. And as she turned off the light, a thought flickered through her mind, gentle but unshakable. He tried to bury her in doubt, but she grew roots in the truth.